Deedle-dum-dum. There was a turtle by the name of Bert, and Bert the turtle was very alert. When danger threatened him, he never got hurt. He knew just what to do. He'd duck and cover, duck and cover. He did what we all must learn to do. You and you and you and you. Duck and cover.
Be sure and remember what Bert the Turtle just did, friends, because every one of us must remember to do the same thing. That's what this film is.
Welcome back to the Cold War Chronicles. Today we're diving into a lesser known but incredibly dangerous moment in history. Able Archer, 83. With tensions at an all-time high, the world stood dangerously close to the brink of nuclear destruction. In this charged atmosphere, NATO initiated Able Archer 83, a war game crafted to simulate the terrifying steps of nuclear escalation and refined command protocols. But to the Soviet intelligence, Able Archer looked like far more than just a drill.
1979, NATO made their double-track decision. This was a simultaneous effort to try to negotiate arms reductions with the Soviets while at the same time deploying advanced U.S. missiles, Pershing II intermediate range ballistic missiles, and Gryphon ground-launched cruise missiles. The Soviets did not consider this parity, though. They considered it an escalation, a direct threat to Moscow.
The Soviets viewed the double-track decision as clear evidence of NATO's willingness to act aggressively. President Reagan's Strategic Defensive Initiative missile defense proposal added to the fear, suggesting that the U.S. might develop a nuclear shield that would enable a first strike without retaliation.
In January 1981, Ronald Reagan was sworn in as the 40th President of the United States. Reagan adopted a much more confrontational posture with the Soviets than his predecessor had. This increased bellicosity led to Soviet paranoia of a possible United States first strike against the Soviet Union. In May 1981, KGB Chairman Yuri Andropov initiated Operation Ryan, which instructed all Soviet intelligence assets around the world to focus exclusively on detecting any signs of a NATO first strike. The incredible amount of intel generated by Operation Ryan helped feed Soviet paranoia.
It's the 1980s, and the Cold War has reached a boiling point. Two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, were locked in a high-stakes standoff, each holding vast nuclear arsenals capable of wiping each other off the map. The fragile peace was built on a balance of terror, known as mutually assured destruction. But as both sides advanced their weapons, the balance of power grew increasingly fragile. In early November of 1983, NATO launched Able Archer 83, a military exercise designed to simulate the full scope of nuclear escalation. It was unlike any previous drill. Able Archer included encrypted communications, command post exercises, and detailed rehearsals for the highest level of nuclear readiness. This wasn't just routine training. It was an all-encompassing simulation carried out as if it were the real thing.
The exercise Able Archer 83 was designed to simulate use of nuclear weapons by NATO forces against Warsaw Pact forces. The Soviets, in their paranoid state, believed that Able Archer was actually cover for a real NATO attack on the Warsaw Pact with nuclear weapons. And the realistic procedures that were being used in the Able Archer exercise were interpreted as signs of an impending attack. Because Able Archer was going to simulate the release of NATO nuclear weapons, which would require authorization from the heads of NATO governments, it was originally intended that President Reagan, Vice President Bush, and Secretary of Defense Weinberger would take part in the exercise. However, National Security Advisor Robert McFarlane argued strongly against this because the added realism might unnecessarily alarm the Soviets. So this was ultimately not done.
With Ryan primed to detect any precursors of nuclear war, Soviet intelligence interpreted Able Archer as a possible first strike. That is because this was no standard drill, and as we'll see, it took only a few critical decisions to bring both superpowers dangerously close to nuclear war. As NATO continued with Able Archer, the realism of the exercise set Soviet forces on high alert. Each new stage, from command authorizations to simulated nuclear launch protocols, seemed to confirm Soviet suspicions. Leaders in Moscow, already anxious over recent reports from Ryan, responded swiftly, mobilizing military units and heightening alert levels to prepare for what they feared could be an imminent attack.
On the 26th of September 1983, just before the Able Archer 83 exercise began, the Soviet OKO early warning system detected 5 ICBM launches from the continental United States. Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov, who was the officer on duty, believed that this launch report was an error and chose to wait for corroborating evidence rather than notifying his superiors immediately. Corroborating evidence never came, and it was later determined that the launch report was a mistake. By not reporting this alleged launch to his superiors, Petrov may have actually prevented World War III.
By this point, the Soviet Union was on what historians would later describe as a hair trigger, poised to respond at the slightest indication of a NATO attack. All it would take was one misinterpreted signal or one unforeseen incident to launch the world into a nuclear conflict.
As previously stated, many Soviet leaders were convinced that Able Archer was actually cover for a real nuclear first strike by NATO, disguised as an exercise. KGB chief Khrushchev, in particular, believed that NATO was fully capable of launching a preemptive strike against the Soviet Union. For him, this was not paranoia. It was plausible.
Able Archer had reached its tipping point. With each passing hour, the Soviet paranoia intensified, and there was a growing possibility that the Soviet Union might strike first in a desperate bid to avoid annihilation. As tensions peaked, Soviet forces were on high alert, with missiles primed, waiting for the signal. But as close as they were to launching a preemptive strike, a crucial factor helped avoid catastrophe: restraint, coupled with intelligence feedback from Soviet embassies and surveillance posts.
Counter to the Soviet paranoia, reports from Soviet embassy staff in NATO countries made no mention of any NATO military mobilization. Soviet intelligence operatives stationed in NATO countries, who were closely observing civilian and military behavior, also mentioned no signs of any military buildup. Additionally, a high-ranking Soviet spy stationed deep within NATO headquarters in Brussels reported to his handlers that he saw no signs of a NATO first strike. All of this information helped allay Soviet fears. Once Able Archer began, the Soviets increased their overall military readiness posture in response to Able Archer. This was detected by NATO, but General Minter, who was head of Allied air forces in Europe, made the decision not to raise NATO's own readiness level because he believed the Soviet action was taken in response to Able Archer. He therefore chose to wait, and once Able Archer ended, the Soviets lowered their readiness level, showing Minter's decision to be the correct one, and it possibly averted a catastrophe.
In the end, this restraint proved decisive. The intelligence feedback indicating that NATO was not mobilizing, combined with the decisions on both sides to hold back, was enough to halt a Soviet response. A series of critical decisions made in those tense hours helped to rein in both superpowers. The Able Archer incident served as a wake-up call for both superpowers. The events of 1983 demonstrated just how close misunderstandings and misinterpretations could bring the world to nuclear catastrophe. In the aftermath, key figures on both sides began to reconsider the risks of unchecked escalation and the fragility of Cold War peace.
President Reagan The events of Able Archer marked a pivotal realization, which was that the Soviets truly feared a NATO first strike, which was very surprising to Reagan. Some observers believe that after this, Reagan purposefully pursued negotiation rather than confrontation, although some observers believe this was Reagan's plan all along. Regardless, the events of Able Archer certainly led to Reagan having a better understanding of the Soviet mindset.
The Able Archer exercise showed the critical importance of clear communication, intelligence sharing, and measured responses to prevent miscalculations and maintain peace. This lesson would shape future U.S.-Soviet diplomacy, reminding both sides of the dangerous fine line they had been treading. Able Archer serves as a powerful reminder of the delicate balance that kept the Cold War from turning hot. This incident showed how close we came to catastrophe, averted only by careful restraint, last-minute intel, and a few critical decisions. It demonstrated the incredible impact of human judgment in an era where one misstep could mean global disaster.
Some have compared the Cold War to a chess game. Others have said it's more like a high-stakes game of poker. It was much more than just straightforward military strategy. It also involved trying to understand the motives and mindsets of your enemy. Espionage, propaganda, and diplomacy all played a critical role in the outcome. But ultimately, it wasn't just military might, but also the willingness to step back from the brink that helped avert World War III.
As we reflect on the Cold War, it becomes abundantly clear that true strength lies not just in military might, but in the ability to exercise caution, seek understanding, and prioritize peace. The lessons of that tense period remind us that avoiding conflict requires more than preparation. It demands diplomacy, transparency, and the wisdom to choose restraint. In today's world, these principles remain as relevant as ever, urging us to remember that preserving peace is the greatest achievement of all.
The Cold War began in June 1948 with the beginning of the Berlin blockade and ended in December 1991 with the fall of the Soviet Union. During those 43 years, 9 U.S. presidents served. The Cold War lasted twice as long as any U.S. hot war. It cost America billions of dollars and thousands of lives, mostly in proxy wars. Some question whether it was worth it. To answer this question is really to answer 2 questions. First, was communism a bad system? Scholars researching the history of communist nations have cataloged its atrocities extensively, with a death toll as high as 100 million people in the 20th century alone. Second, was communism a threat to America and the free West? The Communist International, known as the Comintern, resolved at its Second Congress in 1920 to struggle by all available means, including armed force, for the overthrow of the international bourgeoisie and the creation of an international Soviet republic as a transition stage to the complete abolition of the state. In the last decade of this conflict, Ronald Reagan said, "Freedom and democracy will leave Marxism and Leninism on the ash heap of history." I believe any fair reading of history will not only agree that this was done, but was necessary.